Viewers, on this Dussehra evening, there's news of hard-fought victories to share with you. It appears that Bharat is going to have a bright Diwali illuminated by the glow of economic optimism. Indeed, viewers, we were declared a global bright spot a few months ago. And I'm pleased to tell you that we are holding steady. That optimism, even in the face of pain points, hasn't paled. But there are still some that believe that perhaps we need to be a little more tempered in our optimism. Is there really reason to doubt our recovery, our upward trajectory? Is there something that we're missing here? We're going to go over some of these questions, viewers, with a very esteemed and experienced panel of economists and observers. But here are some numbers for you to glance at. Let's first look at the macro picture. What do we see, viewers? We see India projected to become the third largest economy by 2027. We see India projected to become a $7 trillion economy by 2030. Projected growth of 6.3 in FY24. IPO market rise in 2023. Stronger mergers and acquisition activities in 2023. Global growth contribution to rise to 18% over 5 years. So what's driving this growth? These are good numbers. These are healthy numbers. Well, here's a quick look at the factors. Let's break it down for you sector by sector. Residential sales. These are just indicators of the buoyancy. Almost 2 lakh units sold in the first 9 months of 2023 across top 7 cities of the country. 2023 sales highest since 2008, set to cross the 2 lakh 15 units mark. Let's have a look at automobile sales. Highest sales ever, growth with, and you can see that number there, was 2 crore units sold in H1 of 2023 itself. Sales growth of 7% year on year. 40% jump in workforce in 5 years. These are very impressive numbers. Record sales of 3,61,717 sedans and utility vehicles in September. EV sales likely to grow to over 1.6 crore units by 2030. Green jobs. Let's look at that. Green jobs. Almost, viewers, 1 million to more jobs are coming up. The renewable energy jobs in 2022. So growth is happening in traditional sectors of the economy. Centers earning 117 plus crores via scrap disposal. Even pilgrimage or internal tourism is up. Record 50 lakh pilgrims visited Char Dhams this year. 5.4 lakh vehicles reached Char Dhams this year. First Navratri Puja in Kashmir Sharda temple since 1947. All of this suggests that people are traveling more, they have a little bit of disposable income, and they're not quite feeling the pinch. I might be perhaps overstating the case here. We'll check that out with our experts. But even road connectivity, for example, it's up. So construction activity is up. You can look at those numbers. They are exceeding the numbers of the target that was set over 8 years. 143 lakh crore projected infra spending from 24 to 2030. That's also going to drive growth. 134 lakh crore spent in 7 years, double a projected figure. Global market mobile phone exports. Just look at the global market. We're going out there. I know that export numbers have been down, but certain sectors are doing very well, exceeding expectations. So mobile phone exports have doubled to $5.5 billion just till August. The beauty market is set for double-digit growth over 5 to 10 years. Beauty market is set to rise to $20 billion by 2025. So it's going to be not just a sunrise, but one of those lead growth sectors. Global components set to double by 27. The good thing is that unemployment is also down. Labor force survey of 2022-23 overall 57.9% for 2022-23. That's growth. Female rural employment is up over the last few years, and that number is looking healthy. Viewers, self-employed. The self-employed are growing, which means that perhaps they have confidence that they can go it on their own. But of course, many people will also say it could be because there are not enough formal sector jobs opening. So that's a number that we can look at closely, and there's a debate around it, but let's see which way our experts go on this. The salaried class, well, 21% increase in that number, over 20%. So there's been a bit of an increase there. Unemployment, urban unemployment, 7.7%. So that's also trending, viewers, downwards to 5.4% in 22-23. Unemployment rural, that's also trending downwards, almost half, even though many people will say Manrega uptick is more. We'll also put those contradictions to the test. Male unemployment overall, that is also down, viewers, almost half what it was a few years ago. Female unemployment is also down. I think Surjit Bhalla has also written a little bit about this very recently. Some external winds are favoring India too. Global factors bolstering India's growth. There's anti-China hostility across the globe. India is becoming an alternative manufacturing base. Manufacturing capacity is growing from 17 to 25% by 2023. That's a big jump. Looming slowdown in China, Europe, and America is also giving us this room for optimism on the growth front. And therefore, you have numbers that are being projected, healthy numbers, 2021-22, 9.1%, 22-23, 7.2, 23-24, 6.5% forecast, 2024-25, 6.4% forecast. That number increases in 25-26. All of these, viewers, are sourced to agencies and other important indices that track global growth. Now, if we can sustain the growth, the future looks bright too. And there it is, viewers, the GDP projections by 2075. Look at where we could end up becoming. We could become a 52 trillion economy. Of course, that's still a long way away. Will that also translate into a boom in per capita incomes? That is something that we can also talk about. So let's open this up, and I want to first begin with Surjit Bhalla this evening. There's also Gautam Chikarmane with us. All of these gentlemen don't require introductions, viewers. S.C. Garg, former Finance Secretary, GOI, is also there with us. Santosh Mehrotra, senior economist. It's quite an august and celebrated gathering. And let me begin with you, Mr. Bhalla. You're back from the IMF recently. You were always talking up the India story. I remember when we were speaking just after the COVID, the tailwind of COVID really, and many people were saying that India's done for, we've overcooked the goose, we haven't spent in the right areas, but it appears that some things were done right. Now, first of all, what do you put all this down to? And can the government, for instance, take some credit for this? Or is it all incidental, as some people would have us believe?
Okay, there are several things for which we have to give government credit. First and most important, since you mentioned COVID, it was the food distribution so that people didn't go hungry right after COVID. Then after that, the number one factor contributing to growth, and which is a traditional factor, is investments. And in terms of whether the composition is public or private, overall investment has been very, very high. And that's the number one contributor to growth anywhere in the world. If there's an increase in real investments, there is if you will, an increase in growth rate. So I think the fact that they invested very heavily in infrastructure, the fact that the inflation rate was controlled better than in most countries, certainly better than all the advanced countries, and as good, if you will, as in other countries. So stable macroeconomy, very sound investments, and an increase in investments are the major factors that have contributed to growth.
Okay, Gautam Chikarmani, let me bring you in on this. Has growth been equitable? There is a concern that the rural areas are lagging in this recovery. And that there is, for instance, and let me be very specific, there is demand for work under Manrega, which remains higher than last year, which seems that some people are very dependent on subsistence, or their subsistence is precarious. And also, of course, we have more data that suggests that some FMCG companies have pointed out in their quarterly results that rural demand remains under pressure and continues to lag urban markets. Why is this happening?
Rahul, thanks for inviting me. Delighted to be here. This inequality question at a 2,500 per capita income, for a 2,500 per capita income, I don't see it making much sense. Also, the Gini coefficient, which basically evaluates how unequal an economy is very favorable for India. India's Gini coefficient is far better than US. It's round about equal to China, and it's slightly higher than for Europe. Europe is a better, but within Europe, I think there are countries whose Gini coefficients are worse off than India. So I'm not sure this is the time for to discuss how badly India is doing on the inequality front, because we are doing quite fine when you look at it across the world. Of course, everybody would want that every person should be a millionaire and everybody should have the same amount of money in his pocket, which is not possible. It's a nice dream, it's a utopia. But I don't think India is doing very badly on the inequality front. As we grow, this growth will come, and you may actually see an increase in inequality. But the bottom end, as Surjit just mentioned a few minutes ago, is protected through the food, which is to about 800 million people are getting food at home. So I don't think there is any danger of having an inequality which will result into, say, hunger or people dying of starvation, etc. So that the base is covered. Beyond that, I think we are looking at opportunities. Also, Rahul, every $1 trillion increase in GDP, it leads to new conversations. For instance, it took 4 years for the economy to come from 500 billion to 1 trillion. It took 8 years from 1 to 2. It took 7 years from 2 to 3. And it's going to take about 3.5 years to go from $3 to $4 trillion. Every $1 trillion means approximately 50,000 rupees increase in per capita income. It may not be distributed equally. But I think at the base, once you have this momentum, the growth momentum, it is impossible that all boats will not rise, just as we saw what happened in the 1991 reforms.
Okay, let's open this up. Let's get Professor Mehrotra in on this. High-frequency indicators suggest that economic momentum is sustaining, even as, I agree, pain points remain. Professor Mehrotra, some of those pain points I'm sure you will elucidate upon, but the fact is that the general direction of the economy seems to be treading an upward trajectory, which can only mean that we as a nation, all its people, will benefit.
Well, we hope so, because clearly for the last few years we know perfectly well that it has been a K-shaped recovery. And if we have become the fastest growing large economy in the world, we know that we have. We should never forget that for 20 years we were the second fastest growing large economy in the world. We became the fastest only because China has slowed. We can go into the reasons, we don't have the time for that. So if we have, in terms of having become the fastest growing, well, we have a much lower base than China. We have no choice but to grow fast. And in 15 or 17 years, our demographic dividend is going to run out. So let's return to the reality of the economy. investment was mentioned. So let's remember what this government inherited, and it inherited a 31% to GDP investment rate. It has never gone back to that level, and the growth rate on average for the last 9 years has been 5.7%. Even it went down from what it inherited to 26% most recently, but it has now risen back up to 29%, despite the rise in public investment that, of course, previous speakers have spoken about. The fact of the matter is that private investment is not happening, which is why we are still stuck at 29% of GDP. And in manufacturing, we know perfectly well that the manufacturing sector capacity utilization is below 75%, and no new private investment is going to come as a result of that. Even in respect of public investment, we know that a fiscally constrained government has drawn on surpluses from the public sector undertakings and also from the RBI, and actually increased public investment, which has resulted in it's essentially substitution and replacement for investment that might have taken place by the PSUs and also by the state governments, because the state governments are not being able to invest for a variety of reasons that I could go into, but I want to keep to jump to a few other points that you made, and I think I was taking notes when you were speaking. Let's just remember that in the open unemployment rate was the highest in 2017-18 in the preceding 45 years. Mm-hmm. Since that time, you have just told us in recent times, precisely when the economy has slowed, the labor force participation has risen and and unemployment has come down. Well, let me explain how this paradox is happening. That it's happening we have to look at below the level of this so-called decline in unemployment and increase in WPR. First, there's been a dramatic increase in self-employed people and a very large share at the expense of regular employment. PLFS is telling us this. The government's own data is telling us this. Systematically, for the last several years, regular jobs have fallen. And what has taken its place? Poor quality self-employment. Within self-employment, unpaid family labor has shot up. Women who were outside the labor force have come back into the labor force as unpaid family labor, and that's showing up as quote-unquote employment. So if unemployment has fallen, it's because of this, mainly. Let's come to the issue of inequality. Most recent data, I think, is the following. You mentioned vehicles. Well, SUV purchases have gone up, but two-wheelers and smallest, entry-level four-wheelers are not going up. Point one. Even for FMCG, we know perfectly well that the HUL, the Hindustan Lever chairman, recently said that, rural demand is not growing. The sachets that they sell, well, that's not increasing. You mentioned construction. Sales have increased in 7 major cities. Is 7 major cities all the construction sector of this country? The rest of the country is the major sector, major absorber of construction.
So let's go point by
construction
point.
Has increased. I'm not denying that. Construction and manufacturing.
Okay.
Manufacturing, my friend, actually had fallen from a contribution of 17% of GDP that this government inherited, and it came down to 13%. It has only just climbed back up. So, and at the same time, the share of agriculture in employment shot up in this government in the last 4 years from 42% where it had fallen in 18 to 46% in 22-23.
Okay.
Sir,
Okay.
Let's just remember there's been massive reverse migration. Those workers have not come out of there. Some people have come out,
Okay.
and that's why real
Okay,
wages
let's break
have been
this down.
stagnating.
Let's
I'm
we have
sorry
time.
to tell.
Mr. Mehrotra, we have time, so I'll come back to you. Let's just break this down. Let me bring in Mr. Garg. Mr. Garg, there's a big conversation first about private investments. Mr. Mehrotra, Professor Mehrotra is very convinced it's not happening at the level that it could have. We've never recovered to that 31% GDP level that we saw perhaps in the UPA years. I think that's what he was mentioning. Can you elaborate on this? Why is this the case?
Rahul, before I come to this, let me just make a point about the growth story. In 2019, the government decided to make $5 trillion economy as a goal by 24-25. At that time, we were about 2.7 or $2.8 trillion. And in 5 years, we had expected to reach to 5 trillion. That is not happening. We are only at about 3.6, 3.7 at this end of this year. We will miss 24-25. We'll probably get to 5 trillion by 26-27. And also remember that in the meantime, dollar has also depreciated. So if we take the $29, we will reach at 5 trillion only in 27-28. I am very optimistic. I wrote this book, $10 trillion Dream, because I know India need to grow at about 10 to 11% in dollar terms per annum to be able to double this income every 5 or 6 years to become $10 trillion economy by 2035. Now, when we have this conversation that the kind of growth we have been able to achieve, like this year, 6.5%. If you take 5 years, including the contraction of 2021, we'll be having growth of only about 4% per annum. And that if we sort of try to project as something which is we have done great, I think that is where the problem lies. We should be very, very close to the ground. We should be very sort of conscious of what actually is happening. And if that is what guides our discussion, we perhaps are not doing that well as we need to do. America, UK, France, they are not our competitors any longer. They've grown up, they're advanced economies, their populations have started declining. They have been growing at 2 to 3%, 4% for many years now. They are not growing at 7, 8%. China has come down now to about 5% growth rate. And we need to grow. We are a very low economy. We need to compare with ourselves, Vietnam's and other countries where we are not actually growing that fast to them. We're not growing as fast as our neighbor. Bangladesh is growing. Now, so let me come to now your question about the investment. Now, investment, these numbers can always be cited because the government has been very successful, has been very emphatic on making the capital investment grow to 10 lakh crores this year. But that is what is driving some investment growth. But look at other wider factors and evidences. The foreign investment this year, I think you would be surprised. Today's papers carried it. The foreign investment, net foreign investment this year in the first 5 to 6 months is only about $3 billion. As against it was $18 billion last year. This is the kind of drastic fall. You look at the kind of employment which our IT industry, which employs 1/3 of the organized labor in this country, this year they are actually shedding the employment. They would not be recruiting anybody from the IIMs and the IITs anywhere else where they've been recruiting. So net downfall. Look at the startups, which have been the engine of growth in the economy. So if you look at the real private investment situation, setting aside to some extent the government's own investment of the capital, the story is not actually very inspiring. I find that we, if we don't remove this clutter of this facade of that we are doing very great. IMF said about 6 months, 9 months back, you initially said about the bright, but they are no longer saying, if you read this year's statement, they are saying one of the high growing, 6.5% is a good growth, but that's not for us. For us, it's a very low growth.
Okay, let's first get into that conversation. Mr. Bhalla, 6.5% is not great shakes. An economy like ours needs to grow in double digits if it really wants to lift people out of poverty. Two of our speakers are saying this evening.
Look, I think there's some kind of either misunderstanding or confusion. Where do we get that we need to grow 8, 9, 10% to eliminate poverty? We don't have the latest consumer expenditure survey. I suggest that when the results of the latest consumer expenditure survey, which will shed a light on what is happening to poverty, we wait until that comes out. The survey is complete. We don't know when it'll be released, but let's just wait for that. Now, a couple of other points that have been made. One point has been made is that look at our neighbors, and they're growing so well. Well, let's look at the neighbors. Bangladesh, they just got a big loan or went to the IMF to get a big loan because their economy was suffering. Sri Lanka also went and got a big loan because the economy was suffering. Pakistan also went to the IMF to get a big loan for the economy is suffering. I'm not even going into the details, but I think this notion that we are growing, our neighbors are growing very faster than us is something that is either not understood properly or it is plain wrong. Then we have the investment rate. Now, the 29% cited by Professor Malhotra, that's nominal investment to nominal GDP. Well, as economists, we are really concerned with real investments, one that control for the price level. And one big story in India, as well as in some other countries, but dominantly large in India, is that the price of capital goods has been declining. Or let me put it this way, the relative price of capital goods has been declining. So therefore, the inflation, the price increase for capital goods has been much lower than the price increase for non-capital goods or consumption goods. Then if you adjust for that, it turns out, and you can look at the latest data, anybody can do this calculation, and I will be writing on this very soon. It turns out that in the last quarter, the average, the real investment to GDP rate is 35%. 35, which is one of the highest. I think at its peak in 2004-11, the highest annual rate was something like 37%. So I don't understand where we're getting the notion that investments are not happening or that the investments are very low. We can cite 29%, but I don't think any economist should be using nominal investment to nominal GDP. So investments are high. Our growth rate relative to our neighbors is high. Our growth rate relative to the entire world is high. We are the fastest growing economy. Now, you can say that, look, this is because China has declined. Yes. But, China has been growing at a very, very high rate. Last point I want to make on the China-India growth rate comparison, that between 2011 and 2019, just before COVID, the decline in China's GDP growth rate was from 11.5% to less than 5%. Okay? So that was a decline. While we were beating our chest that, look, our growth rate has declined, China's growth rate had actually collapsed from then. And from now onwards, the expected growth rate for China, according to many institutions, as well as expert commentary, is somewhere around 3%, maybe 3.5% per annum. The same experts, etc., are saying that the growth rate of India will be somewhere around 6.5%, 7%, 6 to 7%. The gap between India and China in our growth rates is our highest ever and expected to expand. So if you want to look at, so the absolute level of the GDP growth in any country, including India, is a function of the growth rate in the entire world. At the time of the big boom in India, as well as the rest of the world, between 2004 and 2011, world growth rate was much higher than it is now. So at that time, we only exceeded world growth by about a couple of percentage points. Now we are exceeding world growth by about 3.5, 4 percentage points. So let's get real, as I say. Look at the environment. Everybody admits that world growth is relevant for any individual country's growth. That is absolutely the case. So how do we measure relative contribution? This is the IMF calculation, not mine. India's contribution to world growth is somewhere going to be between 16 and 20% over the next 5 years. Okay? And it's already at close to 16% this year. That is the year that just passed. So I don't understand what either we say that our growth rate numbers are incorrect, as some analysts do, and then we need to provide evidence that that is the case. We can't just assert that is the case. One last point, since I don't know whether I'll get a chance.
No, of course you will. We've got enough time.
Comment further on Narega. Now, I think, and this is something that, this is an election year. And my guess is that given that all the evidence is there, which you cited, Rahul, at the beginning, about a robust economy, why is the demand for Narega going up? I would look at the state-wise composition of the demand. I would look at the fact that, to what extent is there a jump up around for the last 20 years, jump up in spending on Narega or demand for Narega, quote unquote, anytime there's an election year. You can do it by state levels and you can do it by national levels. So I think that's the political economy of Narega demand. So you can't look at the absolute level. You have to control for what happened the last time there was an election and the GDP growth and what is happening now and what's happening. So Narega, there is a real problem. Demand is going up, which doesn't jive with any other figures on employment. I think, right, and this has to be
there is one more figure.
Research,
there is one more figure. Let me run that past you.
Is due to political spending in an election year.
Okay, but Mr. Bhalla, let me run this figure by you, and I'll get back to Professor Mehrotra before I bring in Mr. Chikkarmane. Mr. Bhalla, there is some concern that there is a jump right now at some level in self-employment, which suggests that the formal economy is not creating the jobs and people therefore have to do, what the opposition says, they become pakora sellers. So can you address this?
Yeah. Good question. And let me just answer that. Around the world, and you can look at Vietnam, high growing economies, look at India. Whenever the growth accelerates, not whenever, there will be some exceptions, but basically a growth in self-employment for developing economies. Remember, there's not much self-employment in advanced economies, but for developing economies like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, like India, that there is an increase in self-employment as the economy transits from, if you will, an informal economy to a formal economy. And this increase in employment first comes about from an increase in female employment, because as their spouses, as the husbands, if you will, get a wage work, they come in and do family work. So this is a research topic. It is what is being observed in India is very common to what has been observed in other developing countries at similar stages of development. So it's nothing extraordinary, and it is indeed. Second, last point on self-employment, I think we need to study this a bit in detail as to what has happened post-COVID. Now, many people, take for example, and the technology, Uber drivers, they're all self-employed. Okay, people who deliver food to your home, fast food, etc., they're all self-employed. They're not salaried workers. So therefore, I think, and then you have, because of the availability of internet, etc., people working from home, they are self-employed. So I think we need to think a little bit more before asserting that, look, this is a problem. I don't know, but I think I like to see the numbers on the various components of self-employment before I jump to the conclusion that this is disturbing. This may very well be a trend for the future, not only in India, but in many countries of the world.
Professor Mehrotra, the charge is that you're not getting real. That's the little dig at you, that you're talking about, for example, in private investments, nominal. You're not comparing real to real, and that's where the problem is. You are cherry picking a fact to state a case. Professor Mehrotra, can you hear me? Are you there with us? I think we might have lost Professor Mehrotra there. Can you hear me, Professor Mehrotra? I think he's... Okay. Let me get Mr. Garg into this. Mr. Garg, what do you believe?
About?
The numbers. You know, we're not comparing the indices as they should be. We're not getting real with the numbers. We're talking in nominal terms. That's what Mr. Bhalla was saying on private investments, for example.
Let's go real. Right. On employment, let me first make a point. If you look at carefully the government employment data which has come up, the increase is in the rural unpaid labor. Self-employment is not a problem. Self-employment is actually the trend for future to go. Salaried jobs will probably get reduced in times to come as the economy becomes gig economy more and more. That's not a problem. In fact, that I don't see that is. But what is the problematic part is this unpaid rural female labor, which is getting counted as employment now or in the workforce. It is very close to what we used to call earlier as disguised.
Hidden employment. I made that point here. Yes. Okay.
This is not employment. And that is the only segment which is increasing. In the self-employment space, to my mind, what is a little bit more concerning is that the average wages growth in the self-employment space is actually not increasing very well. And last point I said was that the clear evidence, the IT industry, which employs 1/3 of our employed people in the listed industry, is actually decelerating, is giving pink slips to people, not recruiting anything. You don't need anything better evidence that the employment situation is actually not that good in the country. Now, coming to the investment side, I think if you compare real to real or the nominal to nominal, on both the fronts, there is a decline in the investment rate. One number which comes out very clearly all the time is the quarterly new investment announcements and all.
Okay.
Recently, that data was also published, and you saw in this quarter a massive decline in the new investment announcements. Private sector is not. I told in the earlier part about what is happening on the FDI front. FDI is the investment. If the FDI is declining by 70, 75, 80% in the first 6 months, either there is a cause for concern.
But Mr. Garg, is that because capital around the world is drying up? it's because of the stress in the global economy. We can always talk about the threats in the next few minutes, but is there really a problem of absorption, of India not being attractive, investment friendly, or is it because there are some headwinds? And this is true for every country.
No, let me explain. I think that is where the real stuff lies. The investment from abroad is becoming a little less attractive because the US interest rates are rising.
Yeah.
That is one factor, but that's not the only factor. You look at our profitability in the manufacturing investment. The government induced investment in two sectors only, the railways and the road transport. There is no other sector where the capital investment is going, barring the arms and ammunitions. These are the two sectors. Other than that, manufacturing, if you look at it, there is no investment flowing. Literally, very little of investment is coming. In services and startups, where there was the real investment opportunities for last 4 years, the terms of trade has changed because now the investors are looking at the profitability of the ventures, not the volume growth which was driving the investments. Now, if that is changed and most of our startups are not making profits, the investment is, instead of flowing in, is flowing out now. In the infrastructure space, barring some corporates from India, for the foreigners, look at any sector for whatever,
Okay.
the investment opportunity is very poor.
Okay.
So that is why they are not bringing the FDI.
So let me bring in Mr. Chikkarmane on this point also. Mr. Chikkarmane, can you respond toe by toe, go toe by toe, toe to toe rather, with Mr. Garg on these facts?
I think
Which facts?
allow me to talk about these from the other side. We want more investment, we want more jobs, etc., etc. Now, who are the job creators? Who are the investment? Who are the people who put investment? Largely, it is large companies. Let me share some numbers with you. There are 63 million enterprises in India, out of which only 1 million are registered for social security, and half of them pay social security actively. We are talking about this 1 million. These are the 1 million enterprises that pay a minimum wage, for instance. These are the people that have worker security, the labor laws, the Factories Act of the past, which is now going to become the 4 labor codes. These are the firms that are on which it is applicable. People don't want to grow. They want to remain under the regulatory radar. As a result, whenever, you know how many companies are there with a paid up capital of 10 crore? Only 22,500. We want the jobs, but we hate the job creators. We hate them intrinsically because they are very rich, as we discussed in the inequality part. And we hate them through policy because we make life very difficult for them. So I think, again, let me give you some numbers over there too. There are almost 70,000 compliances that businesses at an aggregate have to follow.
Yeah.
There are 26,000, more than that, which carry imprisonment clauses, 114 of which were removed 3 months ago through the Jan Vishwas bill.
Yeah.
Every day, there are 10 to 15 regulatory changes that happen on businesses. This uncertainty, I think India needs to decide whether we want the formal jobs, whether we want the job creators, whether we want wealth creators or not. If we want them, we have to embrace them. Otherwise, capital will find its own, as Mr. Garg was saying, that capital will find its own place to go. Having said that, I think India is doing quite well. I think this growth, there is one more point I want to make, Rahul, when we were discussing the previous growth and 6% and 7% IMF, etc. Those are nominal growth. When we talk about a $7 trillion economy, when we talk about a $10 trillion economy, we need to look at nominal growth, not real growth. Nominal growth of India will be whatever is the real growth plus inflation. So I would put it at around 12 to 14% depending on how fast we grow. Despite that, our base at 3.5, 3.7 trillion is too small to make a global impact. Yes, there may be that 16 to 20% contribution to global growth. Yes, it may happen. But even a 12% growth will only yield about $400 billion. Now you compare that with the Chinese real growth of 7%, we are looking at 1 trillion. You look at the US growth of 6%, we are looking at 1.5 trillion. So India at 3.5 trillion has a long way to go. Having said that, internally, I can see, all of us can see, the numbers are showing up. India is growing. The bottom, as I said, the bottom is protected. And finally, these policies, the laws, rules, regulations are executed at the state level. And I think it's time now. We keep saying India is not growing and keep implying that the union government is at fault. That's not the case. Growth happens in the states. GDP is built in the states. The land for steel, the land for infrastructure, it's in the states. And I think now the next level, hopefully after the elections, because till the elections we cannot expect any great policies to come through. After the union elections, I hope, and I think all of us, irrespective of our view on this panel, hope that the states begin to get their act together. And I think a large part of that is compliance reforms.
Okay, let me bring in Mr. Bhalla on this point. It's an important one because you were sort of veering towards that before you sort of pull back. I want you to just crystal gaze because there is a national election coming up. There are continuous and endless cycles of state elections. And what we are seeing is a lurch towards economic populism, which worries at the state level. This is unsustainable fundamentally. How much of this actually poses a threat to our continued growth, Mr. Bhalla?
Look, I think it's a very important point. We should all be very concerned about it, and the populism at the state level and elections, etc. You know, there is a simple solution, correction to the state level populism. And I hope this comes about. You know, I'm not expecting it to come about now before the national elections. But post the national elections, we will not be discussing state populism that much if, when states have to borrow to finance their deficit, remember what populism leads to is more expenditures. And you can do the expenditures, okay, you know, this is manna from heaven or manna from the government, and I can spend on populism. Simple correction is as follows. When states have to borrow, they go to the capital market. So therefore, Maharashtra will be able to borrow at a lower rate than Punjab will be. So very simple solution, correction, you know, and it is part and parcel of us wanting to be a developed economy, whether by 2047 or earlier, that, listen, we need to move towards market procedures, market checks and balances. The only way politicians can be checked and their expenditures and their freebies can be checked is if there is a market discipline. So I'm hopeful after the elections, it's independent of who wins the elections, but after the elections, whoever comes in needs to bring about this simple reform. And I challenge anybody to disagree with it. That, listen, if states want to finance, they go to the market. Remember, it was, I think, maybe Gotham remembers it or whatever, 30, 40 years ago, when in the US, the states were also their budget deficits were being financed more or less by borrowing, and the federal government regulated. And there was a New York Times headline or New York Post headline, "Drop Dead New York," because the deficit has got out of control. Now, the state deficits in the US are not out of control because they have to go to the marketplace. So why not this simple solution? And I'm surprised that commentators are not commenting on this very simple solution. Correction, I should say. It's not a solution. It's a correction to freebies.
Can I come in, Rahul, on this question?
On the marketplace.
Okay, we don't have much time. Mr. Garg, yes, please, very quick one.
I think some facts. Number one, the states borrow within the fiscal deficit limits set up. The states in last 5 years, despite COVID, etc., have never exceeded 3% of GSDP as their borrowings. It is absolutely wrong and false to categorize the states as fiscal spendthrifts and irresponsible. On the other hand, if you look at
Sir.
the government of India in last 5 years, on an average, has borrowed over 6% of GDP, against what the law puts it at 3%.
3%.
As the ceiling.
I think, viewers, we've had a meaty discussion. We don't often have meaty discussions. It's been free of, I think, a degree of politics. I think we've looked at numbers this evening. There is always a shadow of politics, and that also determines how we look at the data, unfortunately. It gives a slightly jaundiced view of what we want to see in the numbers. I'm not saying that anyone here was trying to sort of either favor or not, but the fact is that people have their agendas. The point is, viewers, net, there is growth. There is growth against what 2 years back people were saying, that we are actually going to go down. That hasn't happened. Now, we can talk about the quality of that growth, and that's a welcome conversation. We should definitely have it, but there is growth. So there is reason for optimism and perhaps a little bit of light as we go into Diwali. I leave it at that.